All right, let's quickly recap the action because it was actually pretty complicated. So Fedor opens the hijack of a stack of 120 big blinds, and then Kaina shoves the cutoff for 25 big blinds. I think this is a pretty crucial mistake to go all in with ace-4 suited there. The hand is just not good enough in terms of equity when you get called. The blockers aren't quite good enough, even though a suited hand always looks pretty, especially if it's a suited wheel ace. I think the main play with her hand here is to just flat call or sometimes 3-bet bluff, which would have saved her a lot of trouble in this particular spot. But well played to have the balls here to go all in for your tournament life with such a hand. Maria sits in the small blind and covers everyone in the hand, and she decided to flat. I think that's a pretty nice play to have a flatting range here because you don't necessarily want to risk your whole stack against Fedor's range, who could sometimes wake up with a hand when you call the all-in of Kaina. However, I think you need to have a split here. So hands like pocket kings and probably ace king off as well also want to isolate a little bit. Ace king off just enjoys pushing out equity in Fedor's range quite a lot, and pocket kings are a very good hand to balance this play, to induce some bluffs for the dead money that she might put in when Fedor decides to shove on her with a ace blocker or with ace king himself that might not go broke post flop anymore with pocket queens, because when she 4-bets, he doesn't really have the opportunity to flat call anymore. So Maria's range doesn't contain some specific hands that much anymore. She doesn't have kings. She shouldn't have that much ace king off, which is going to be very crucial in the remainder of these hands, but she's going to have a condensed range purely like queens, jacks, 10s, 9s. I think 8s are already pretty dicey, and she has hands like ace king suited, ace queen suited, but that's almost about it. A little bit of ace queen off is in there as well, and ace king off. Kings should be reduced, queens should be reduced, and aces are probably the main trap in her shoes. So when it falls back to Fedor, I think his overcall with pocket queens is pretty good here, especially in a protected pot where you might be behind against Kaina's range as well, or might want to take a flop first to decide how good your hand is going to be later. So let's see how the action continues. So don't go to a flop 3-way. The flop is queen check 8 monotone. Maria checks to Fedor, who decides to bet 600k, which is around 20% of the pot. Later on in the hand, he comments that he thinks this bet is a little bit too small. I kind of agree. Usually this bet size is very standard in 3-bet pots on mono boards, but that's usually the case because the ranges are relatively suited and still contain a lot of unpaired hands. And in those cases, it's really good to go small on mono boards because there's a lot of auto folds in the defender's range or in the other player's range. If he has a suited hand that is not the suit of the board, he will often have very, very little equity and needs to continue very snug. And for that reason, very small bet sizes are usually very good in these spots. However, in this scenario, there is not that many unpaired hands in the ranges to begin with. So that's a little bit of an issue, which I think Fedor recognized it himself would justify a little bit of a bigger bet. Also, if you think about the range, there's not really too many misses in Maria's range, and for that reason, he can probably get a little bit more value there. However, betting at all is very good and super important here, which might not be standard to everyone because you're playing a protected pot. So there's basically nothing in the middle right now between the two players left to act, because Kaina could have the nuts here. She could have a flush, she could have ace queen with the ace of diamonds or something like that, and ranges could be drawing very thinly. And for that reason, some players sometimes get a little bit too tricky in these spots, but you need to build a pot for yourself in Fedor's shoes as well. And that's what he does. Maria calls and they go to the turn, which is a meaningless deuce of hearts. Maria checks again and Fedor second barrels again for 20% pot. Another suite where you can size a little bit bigger, but we are really talking about nuances. Maybe 25% pot. You can see if he gets called here, he's gonna have like 30% pot left on the river, which is not a high SPR either. Anyway, they both go to the river, which is the 10 of hearts, giving Maria a straight. And now she decides to lead out for around 20% pot herself. Extremely tricky spot for Fedor because you only need to be right around 15% of the time if we ignore Kaina's range. And we shouldn't really do that, but we have to start at some point. Let's go through the ranges together and try to figure this out. So we can use a very classic equity calculator here and start breaking down the ranges. So we thought that Maria probably starts out the hand with something like ace check suited, ace ace queen off plus and pocket eights plus, and now we already decided she might not have too much pocket kings to start the hand with, not too much pocket queens, but maybe a little bit. So let's give her half the combination, something like that. It doesn't really matter too much when we get to the actual river. And we also said she might not always have all the ace king off hands. We need to be a little bit careful here to reduce the right combinations, or to let her have, for the sake of the hand, let's actually assume she will have 2/3 of the diamond combinations and like around 2/3 of ace king off in general. So let's say this is about her pre-flop range that she gets to the flop with. Now Fedor goes in a very long tank in the river and explains his thought process during the hand and afterwards again. I agree with most of the stuff he says. She could have pocket eights, but they don't really need to bluff the river. They are a value hand. They would isolate themselves quite heavily. So I think it's not really in her range anymore. And Fedor talks about Maria not bluffing jacks or tens, which is interesting because you could argue it's maybe some kind of thin value blocker bet. But if you think about the ranges, Fedor's absolutely right. It would be kind of a bluff because Fedor's range definitely does not contain pocket kings or pocket aces. And I don't think he would really call ace queen off or even bet it twice on the flop and turn. So when Maria would bet a hand like tens or jacks, she would only get called by better sets or flushes or straights. So Fedor's absolutely right. It would be a bluff, and I don't think she would find it. Ace jack suited, he says, should fold on the turn, and I definitely agree. So let's remove that as well. Pocket aces probably play differently as well. I don't think they ever bet the river. They might have check raised at some point. They might have led at some point. So it's not a hand that plays a role at all in the spot. Also, ace king suited is really only present as a flush. All the other combinations, hearts, clubs, spades, have folded to turn by the latest as well. Might not even be in a pre-flop flatting range, but that's a different story. Ace queen probably also doesn't really ever lead the river. It's still a little bit of showdown value against give-ups from Fedor he might have, but it's really rare in between that he actually gets to the river with a hand that can give up and has air. However, I don't really think without any form of blockers, Maria would get to the conclusion that it's a good spot to lead here. So I'm going to remove that as well. Queens, I don't think she plays like this either. Could sometimes raise on a previous street, and on the river, it's basically a bluff catcher, as you see in Fedor's decisions. So she's definitely not leading this one either. And pocket nines, Fedor mentions, can only get there ever with a diamond. However, he thinks it's pretty unlikely that she calls the turn, which I agree with, but we will get to that later. So an ace queen off, he thinks this could be her bluff. There's only one combination left when he has the two queens. I gave him the queen of hearts and queen of clubs, even though I think he had a queen of hearts and queen of spades. Doesn't really matter. We just need to make sure. Maria has one ace diamond and a queen combination left in her range. Yeah, let's assume this would be a range. Ace king for a flush, some ace kings that got to the flop to begin with, some pocket nines with a diamond, and ace queen with the ace of diamonds as a bluff. You can guess now how much equity Fedor has against this range and if this would be sufficient. If it was a heads-up scenario, he would need around 15% to call here, but the spot is a little bit worse with Kaina being left in the hand. Nobody of the player really knows what she has, but she could easily have pocket nines, ace king herself. There's a lot of hands that could beat both ranges here, so it's still important to keep that in mind. All right, so take your guess now. How much equity does pocket queens have against this range? It's 7.7%. However, I agree with Fedor. I think you can probably assume that Maria folds some of her pocket nines on the turn. And we also need to deduct all the ace king offsuits that don't have diamond. So we only started out with 4 of these combinations, and these are the only ones that get to the river. Ace king off with a diamond as a king or an ace. And against this range, it's probably going to look a little bit better. You can take your guess again, and now we are up to 16.7%. So basically just enough to make a winning call against the Maria range. Heads up though, and now it really depends if she finds the bluff with the ace of diamond queen offsuit. If she doesn't, we are drawing dead. And if she sometimes rips the ace king off pre-flop, then we are in great shape actually, because that's one thing Fedor pointed out at some point during the hand when he talked through his thinking process. He said there is no value, and I think in that moment moment, he considered Maria to shove all their ace-king off pre-flop. And if you don't have this hand in your range and you actually find this bluff with the ace of diamond, queen of spades, it's actually a range consisting of two combinations. Ace-king for the flush and one bluff. So you would have 50% equity against Maria, which would be a printing call in this scenario. I think this is a little bit of a too extreme assumption, but I definitely agree we need to discount some of the ace-king combinations here. And now it's basically a little bit of a guesswork how much is left in Maria's range, but we will probably end up somewhere between 15 and 25%. And even though it looks like nobody has ever a bluff here, as soon as you give your opponent credit that he might find a bluff like ace of diamonds, queen of spades, or queen of hearts, or whichever was unblocked, then you probably have a call here. Given how the hand played out, I think Kaina's range is the determining factor to still turn it into a fold, because I think Fedor's range probably has around 16-18% against Maria, which is sufficient in a heads-up spot. But I don't know Maria's game good enough, so I can't really judge if she ever finds the bluff with ace of diamond, queen of clubs or not. And for me, I think it would feel a little bit too close. However, I don't fault Fedor for his call there. It's an extremely rare and complicated situation, and figuring out this in-game under a lot of pressure is close to impossible in my opinion. I think Fedor's thought process was really, really good. He made the best of the situation, so heads up to him.